It began as a vision, born on the banks of the Tiber, carried by men who believed they could defy the limits of destiny. Rome was not just a city, it was a dream forged in iron and fire, a promise of eternal glory. But dreams, when stretched beyond their limits, can twist into shadows. And the empire that once claimed to rule the world would awaken to find its triumphs fading into nightmares. In the beginning, there was only a fragile settlement on the banks of the Tiber. Muddy huts, scattered fields, the smoke of meagre fires rising into the Italian sky. It was a place no greater than a whisper in the wilderness, a mere mark upon the map of time. And yet, within that humble cluster of souls, something stirred. A hunger fierce and unrelenting, a belief that from mud and straw could rise something eternal. They were farmers, herdsmen, wanderers, bound together not by wealth or power, but by the will to survive. Yet survival was not enough. In their hearts burned a vision that one day their city would command the horizon. Every stone laid upon the 7 hills was not just the foundation of a home, but the foundation of destiny. Rome was not born by chance. Rome was willed into existence, carved from struggle, bound in blood, and carried by men who believed they could defy the limits of mortality itself. Imagine the streets of that young city. Dust swirling in the air, traders shouting over the hum of barter, children weaving between the stalls. The walls were rough, the buildings simple, but there was something in the air, a quiet confidence, a pulse beneath the stone. The people believed they were chosen. And when the people believe they are chosen, they become unstoppable. Their dream was not confined to the wealthy or the powerful. A farmer bending to sow his grain believed he was feeding the heartbeat of a future empire. A mason, chiseling marble, believed his work was destined to stand for eternity. Even the poorest citizen, armed with nothing more than bread and hope, carried pride within his chest, for he knew he belonged to something greater than himself. Rome was more than a city, it was a promise. A dream whispered into every soul who called it home. And when that dream began to march, the world trembled. Legions of ordinary men, plucked from fields and families, hardened into a machine of discipline, endurance, and unyielding will. With every step of their sandals upon foreign soil, with every clash of steel, Rome's vision stretched outward, pushing her borders beyond river and mountain, beyond sea and desert. The eagle standards rose high against the sun, casting shadows that fell upon kingdoms, tribes, and nations who could only watch in awe and in terror. The dream became real. Roads cut across lands like veins in a living body, binding distant corners into one beating heart. Aqueducts bent rivers to man's command, as though the gods themselves had surrendered their waters. Amphitheatres thundered with the voices of thousands, rejoicing not merely in spectacle, but in the glory of being Roman. For a time, just a time, it felt as though eternity had been captured, held within marble law and blood, but dreams are cruel things. They dazzle, they inspire, and they blind. What began as survival became ambition. What began as ambition became conquest, and conquest unchecked became obsession. The fire that had once lifted Rome above obscurity now burned hotter, brighter, threatening to consume not only her enemies, but her very soul. In these days, at the dawn of her greatness, none could see the shadow that lay ahead. To live in Rome, then, was to believe you were immortal. To walk her streets was to feel the weight of destiny upon your shoulders. Her poor found hope in her victories. Her wealthy found fortune in her spoils, and her leaders found immortality in her triumphs. It was a dream so vast, so magnificent, that the world itself bent before it. But even as the world bowed, the seeds of darkness had already been sown. For dreams, no matter how glorious, always carry with them the possibility of becoming nightmares. Rome's dream did not remain bound to the 7 hills. It stretched outward, hungry, insatiable, and unstoppable. What had once been a fragile settlement was now a storm sweeping across the ancient world. Her legions, steel, discipline, and fury wrapped into human form, became the very instruments of destiny. They marched with precision, their sandals pounding the earth in rhythms that shook kingdoms to their knees. Wherever the eagle standards flew, resistance withered, nations fell. And the world began to speak the name of Rome with both reverence and fear. The victories came swift and unrelenting. From the green fields of Gaul to the burning sands of Africa, from the forests of Germania to the coasts of Britannia, the empire grew like a living beast swallowing lands whole. Each conquest fed its body. Each triumph strengthened its bones. Cities that had once stood proud under their own banners were redrawn into Rome's tapestry. To defy her was to invite annihilation. To surrender was to be woven into her dream. The legions were not merely soldiers. They were architects of empire. Behind them followed roads, veins of stone stretching in every direction, binding the world together. Aqueducts carried life where drought had ruled, bending rivers to Rome's command as though even nature itself could not resist her will. Marble cities rose from conquered soil, stamped with the unmistakable mark of Roman design, arches, forums, temples, theatres. Wherever Rome set foot, she did not just conquer, she remade. With this expansion came a new identity. Rome was no longer a city. Rome was the world. The Mediterranean, once divided by tribes and kingdoms, now became a Roman lake, its waters patrolled by her fleets, its ports brimming with grain, gold, and slaves. Trade flourished, ideas spread, and law travelled faster than the whisper of rebellion. The empire became a machine so vast, so efficient, that even its enemies could not help but marvel at its strength. But beyond the order, beyond the brilliance of marble and law, there was something darker. Every triumph demanded a price. The blood of countless lives watered Rome's victories. Nations that resisted were chained, their people sold in markets, their cultures ground beneath the weight of empire. For the grandeur of Rome's expansion was not built only on ingenuity, but on conquest, on fire, steel, and still, for those within her embrace, the dream seemed unstoppable. To be Roman was to belong to eternity. The amphitheatres roared with life. The temples shone with offerings to the gods, and senators draped in purple spoke of an empire that would last forever. They believed they had bent history itself to their will. Rome in her triumphs stood as a colossus striding across the known world, convinced that nothing could bring her low. But as the empire grew, so too did the cracks. Expansion was both glory and burden. The further Rome stretched, the more fragile her hold became. Her victories dazzled the world, but in their brilliance lay the seeds of arrogance, of exhaustion, of decay. For even the mightiest dream, when stretched too far, begins to tremble at the edges. And while Rome bathed in triumph, the shadow of her nightmare drew closer. Every empire, no matter how radiant, carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. Rome was no exception. Beneath the marble and the thunder of triumphs, shadows began to stir, subtle at first, invisible to those blinded by the glare of glory. But the cracks were there, creeping silently through the very foundations of the dream. Expansion had given Rome the world, but it also gave her burdens too vast to bear. The legions, once the proud instruments of destiny, were now stretched thin, scattered across endless frontiers. Each new conquest demanded mended coin, demanded blood. The empire had grown into a beast too large to feed, and slowly it began to devour itself. Wealth poured into Rome like a flood, but it did not flow evenly. The spoils of empire piled high in the hands of the elite, while the poor were left with crumbs. Vast estates rose across the countryside, worked by slaves taken in conquest, displacing the humble farmers who had once formed the backbone of the Republic. The dream of shared destiny twisted into a reality of division, of inequality so sharp it cut the very fabric of society. In the Senate, corruption festered. Bribes bought influence, and power was no longer earned but purchased. Ambition, once the lifeblood of Rome's greatness, curdled into greed. Leaders sought not the glory of the Republic, but the glory of themselves. Promises of reform were drowned in betrayal, and the laws that had once bound Rome together became weapons wielded by the powerful against the weak. Even the people, once bound by a fierce pride in their city, grew restless. Bread and spectacle replaced duty and sacrifice. The roar of the amphitheatre became a substitute for purpose, and the blood of gladiators distracted from the fractures spreading across the empire. The very citizens who had once carried Rome's destiny now sought only comfort, pleasure, and escape from the growing weight of decay. And all the while, enemies gathered at the edges. The tribes beyond the Rhine and the Danube, the Persians in the east, they watched as the giant stumbled under its own weight. The eagle standard still flew high, but their shadow no longer carried the same terror. For even the world could sense what Rome could not, that eternity is fragile, and the dream was beginning to rot from within. This was the tragedy hidden beneath the triumphs. Rome had been forged by hardship, lifted by discipline, sustained by unity. But success had stolen those virtues. In wealth, she found weakness. In conquest, she found corruption. In comfort, she found decay. The empire that believed itself eternal had sown the very seeds of its own destruction, seeds that in time would grow into the nightmare from which Rome. And then the cracks became chasms. The dream that had once seemed eternal began to splinter before the eyes of its own people. The seeds of decay had taken root, and now they blossomed into chaos. Rome, once a colossus striding across the world, began to stumble. Civil war tore through the empire like wildfire. Generals turned their legions not against foreign enemies, but against their own countrymen. Power was no longer the servant of Rome. It was the prize. The Senate, once the heart of order, became a theatre of intrigue and betrayal. Brothers turned on brothers, fathers on sons, and the blood that stained the earth was Roman blood spilled by Roman hands. And beyond the borders, the world was watching. Tribes that had long feared the iron discipline of the legions now sensed weakness. The Goths, the Vandals, they pressed harder, no longer cowed by the shadow of the eagle standards. The empire's defences, stretched across thousands of miles, buckled under the weight of endless invasions. Walls crumbled, cities burned. What had once been Rome's strength, her vastness, became her greatest vulnerability. The economy withered. Gold, once flowing freely, now trickled into empty coffers. Trade routes faltered, farms lay abandoned, and hunger crept into the streets of the eternal city. Desperation replaced pride. The grandeur of marble forums echoed with silence, their columns standing as hollow monuments to a greatness that was slipping away. The people who had once proclaimed their destiny now whispered of doom. But perhaps the greatest tragedy was not in what Rome lost, but in what Rome had become. The unity that carried her from mud huts to empire was gone. In its place stood greed, division, and despair. Soldiers sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. Leaders clung to power, not to serve the people, but to serve themselves. The dream had turned inward, devouring itself like a serpent eating its own tail. And as the empire unraveled, the nightmare grew darker. Fires that had once lit the world now consumed it. The glory that had once inspired awe now inspired pity. The very name of Rome, once whispered in fear across deserts and forests, was now spoken with doubt. The dream had become a shadow, and the shadow stretched long across history. At last the dream collapsed. The eternal city, once the beating heart of the world, was brought to its knees. Its walls, once thought unbreachable, were breached. Its streets, once alive with triumph, were drowned in fire and blood. The empire that had promised eternity could not escape the hand of time. Rome, invincible Rome, fell. It was not a single fall, but a slow and agonizing unraveling. Piece by piece, province by province, the empire withered and remained. The West, stripped of its pride, succumbed to the weight of barbarian conquest. The emperors, once gods in marble and purple, became puppets, shadows of what had been. The people who had believed themselves chosen now wandered through ruins, staring at broken columns, at toppled statues, at dreams reduced to dust. And yet, in her death, Rome left behind something more enduring than conquest. She left warnings etched into the scars of history. She showed the world that power, no matter how absolute, is fragile. That ambition, unchecked, becomes poison. That an empire built on the shoulders of conquest cannot forever outrun the cost of blood. Rome's nightmare is a mirror held up to all who would follow in her footsteps. But she also left behind fragments of brilliance, roads that still trace the earth like veins of memory, laws that echo in the courts of nations long after her fall. Language, architecture, ideas, seeds that outlived the empire that planted them. Even in her nightmare, Rome could not help but shape the future. This is the legacy of the greatest dream mankind has ever dared. A city of mud huts rose to command the world, only to drown in its own glory. Rome reminds us that empires are mortal, that eternity is an illusion, and that even the brightest lights cast the darkest shadow. She was a dream and a nightmare, and her story is a warning that whispers still across centuries to those who would believe themselves eternal. So, we stand now, centuries removed from the ashes of Rome, yet the echoes remain. The marble has crumbled, the legions are dust, but her story is carved into the memory of mankind. It is not merely history, it is a warning. For every nation that rises, for every people who dare to dream of eternity, Rome whispers from the grave, greatness is not invincible, power is not everlasting, and ambition unchecked can consume all. The dream of Rome became a nightmare, not because she reached too high, but because she forgot what made her strong: discipline, unity, sacrifice. Instead, she drowned in greed, division, and arrogance. And if such a colossus could fall, then so too can we. The call is clear. Learn from her triumphs, but heed her downfall. Build, but with humility. Dream, but with wisdom. And never forget that the mightiest empires are still bound by the same truth. Nothing lasts forever. Rome's story is not just hers, it is ours. And it is up to us to decide whether we repeat her nightmare or forge a different destiny.